Richard Kaufman is here again with us this Sunday for his second presentation. Last Sunday, he reminded us of many of the scriptures relating to death, and today he's offered death and the Christian hope. Welcome. Thanks for coming back.
I had something to eat yesterday that made me incredibly thirsty. So I'm going to have to hang on to my water bottle here. Yeah. Please, people in the back, let me know if you can't hear me, okay? Or if I drop my voice or if I talk too quickly. Somebody told me I talk too quickly. And that I know that can be a problem. Okay, so right, as Del said, I talked last week about death. And today I want to talk about death and the Christian hope. What can we hope for in terms of the future? Ooh. So we're getting into territory in which I feel the need for us to be somewhat modest and humble and not speak dogmatically, as though we know for sure what all is going to happen in the next life. But I will speak today largely out of Christian tradition. So I'm not speaking for myself necessarily. I'm representing Christian tradition. And I hope that I'm being faithful to, well, not just the Christian tradition, but the biblical tradition, which would include much of Judaism. So just as a reminder of the modest approach I think we need to take, Paul said, "For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part, then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known. And now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, and the greatest of these is love." So the bottom line here is love. Or again, Paul said, "No eye has seen, nor ear heard, nor the human heart conceived what God has prepared for those who love him." And Ludwig Wittgenstein, some consider him the greatest philosopher of the 20th century, and he spoke in riddles sometimes, enigmatic statements. He said, "It is love that believes the resurrection." Just mull that over a little bit. I'm not going to exegete that. And then he also said, "What we cannot speak about, we must pass over in silence." So I'm not saying we can't speak about the resurrection because our tradition and biblical faith speaks to the resurrection. But again, modesty is important. These two are enigmas that keep us open to mystery, not to try to explain the mystery, but to embrace the mystery. Anybody here, has anybody here read this book? I think it's only about a year old. So before I get into the book, in his later years, I was driving with my grandfather and we had kind of a long distance drive and opened up good conversation. And he shared with me an experience that he had had that I'm not aware that he ever shared it with anybody else in the family. I don't think my mother knew about this. He had been in the hospital and he was unconscious. And he had this experience of being in a tunnel. And there was light in the tunnel, at the end of the tunnel, and Jesus was there. beckoning him to come forward. And then all of a sudden the light went out and he came to. And there were people, medical personnel, standing all around his bed. And they said, "We almost lost you." So he had one of these near-death experiences. Now, Junger was a skeptic about the afterlife, didn't really think that there was an afterlife at all. And then during a medical emergency, he had one of these experiences and he changed his mind. He at least opened up the possibility that, in fact, we can expect an afterlife. And so he did a study of these NDEs, and this is not the only book on NDEs, there are other ones around. And he said it's kind of amazing, not just that they happen, but in his study of NDEs across cultures and religions, there are a lot of similarities between them. So people have similar kinds of experiences. Now, they wouldn't all have one like my grandfather had, where Jesus was present there, bidding him to come in other religions. But in other respects, they're very much alike. But he said an hour after he had this near-death experience, a nurse came to him and asked him how he's doing. And he said, "Well, I nearly died." And that was terrifying. It's a terrifying experience. And she said to him, "Well, rather than seeing it as being terrified, what about seeing it as being holy? Holy." And a few days later, he tried to find out who this nurse was. He wanted to talk to the nurse, and no one knew who this nurse was. He was not able to contact this nurse. And he came to the conclusion, maybe that nurse actually didn't exist, but he had this experience. Kind of remarkable. So I bring NDEs in here because I don't think near-death experiences prove that there is an afterlife. I mean, some people say there are biochemical or neurochemical explanations for these, and that may be true. However, I see these near-death experiences as being analogous to arguments for the existence of God. Arguments for the existence of God do not prove the existence of God, but they do open up the possibility that God may exist. They make theism plausible. And I see NDEs as being the same way, that they do make an afterlife seem plausible to us. Now, there are a variety of afterlives in religion and philosophy. The Greek view is that we're dualistic beings. We have a material self, which is the body, and we have a spiritual self, which is the soul. And when we die, the material body deteriorates and goes away, and what is left is the soul. And the soul is, at that point, freed from the prison of the body. The Hindu view is somewhat similar. There's the whole idea of transmigration of the soul, or reincarnation. The dead return in another body, and it's based on the karma from their previous existence. The Buddhists say there's an ongoing circle of birth, death, and rebirth. Karma here too is relevant for the rebirth. But the goal with Buddhism, unlike Hinduism, is nirvana, or enlightenment, an actual extinction. In other words, release from this endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, and to end up eventually like a drop of water in the ocean. Talked quite a bit last time about the Old Testament in particular. The dead go to Sheol, it's that shadowy intermediate state. But in the Old Testament already, as I said last time, there are hints of afterlife and even a resurrection in the Old Testament. Now, we know from the New Testament that Jews in Jesus' time did not all agree on this issue about resurrection. The Pharisees, they were the party that adhered to a strict understanding of the Old Testament law, but they believed in the resurrection, what we would call the general resurrection, That is, when God's people, as a people, are raised up again and renewed as God's people. So in that sense, resurrection is not something that happens to the individual, it's something that happens to the whole community. The Sadducees, who had arguments with Jesus over this issue, of course, were strict biblicists. You might say, well, they seem like the liberals because they rejected the resurrection. Well, in some respects, they were more like the fundamentalists. They were strict biblicists, and they didn't accept oral tradition, and they rejected the idea of the resurrection. So, as we know from Matthew 22, the same day some Sadducees came to Jesus saying, there is no resurrection. And they asked him a question saying, Teacher, Moses said, if a man dies childless, his brother shall marry the widow and raise up the children for his brother. And went on to have a conversation about that. So far as the Muslims, understanding is when they die, they go straight to heaven, and it's kind of a paradise, it's kind of a garden setting with streams flowing through. And then the Christian view, as I will try to unpack as we go along here, there are two aspects of resurrection. The first aspect of that is Jesus' own resurrection, which is the basis of our resurrection, which comes later. So just to step back again a little bit and look at the Old Testament, this very familiar passage from Ezekiel 37 about the dry bones that were raised up. This probably in the first instance was a promise about the restoration of the people of Israel after exile. But in time, this image of the resurrection of these bones and the joining of these bones and bringing new life into them, that came to represent resurrection, both in the Jewish community and the Christian community. There. I'll just move on here. So before I get into resurrection from a New Testament perspective, I think it's important to kind of underscore some points here, which I got from Gerhard Lofink. Gerhard Lofink is a Catholic New Testament scholar. I became aware of him initially when he wrote a book probably 40 years ago on Jesus and community. And it has an awful lot of themes in it that resonate with, I think, Anabaptist thought. And he himself was part of some kind of intentional community. I don't really understand that community at all. But he said there are three things that we have to keep in mind from a biblical faith perspective. The one is biblical faith takes seriously creation and this world. And it doesn't encourage spiritualizing the faith or escapism. And the second point is that biblical faith cares about the well-being of the whole person, not just the soul or the spirit or whatever you want to call the non-material part of human existence. And thirdly, biblical faith takes seriously death. It doesn't try to sugarcoat. And I hope I made that point last week in my talk about death from a biblical perspective. So Judaism only gradually came to a position of accepting resurrection. And as we saw, not even all the Jews accepted the concept of resurrection, but even those who did accept resurrection, they never minimized these 3 points. They continued to emphasize these 3 things: creation, the whole person, and death. So, resurrection. Well, the Apostles' Creed kind of crystallizes perspective. Jesus Christ was crucified, died, and was buried. He descended into hell. On the third day, he rose again from the dead. He ascended into heaven and is seated at the right hand of God the Father Almighty. From there, he will come to judge the living and the dead. I believe in the forgiveness of sins, the resurrection of the body, and life everlasting. I only lift this up because it kind of crystallizes perspective of the New Testament. So now to focus more particularly on Jesus' resurrection. There are 2 traditions, 2 biblical traditions involved, and 2 outcomes. first tradition had to do with resurrection appearances. Jesus appeared to his disciples and other people, and there were these empty tomb accounts. Those are two different traditions. I'll say more about that later. There were two outcomes. One was retroactive and the other prospective. I'll go there first. So the retroactive effect of the resurrection was that it reversed the defeat of Christ on the cross. I mean, Jesus dying on the cross looked like the end, right? And the disciples became very, very despondent about this, and they kind of came to the conclusion that Jesus wasn't who he said he was. He wasn't the Messiah after all, and they went back to their former lives initially. Well, the resurrection was a defeat of the cross without undermining the cross. It also confirmed that Jesus was indeed the Son of God. And it confirmed his power to forgive sins, heal the sick, and to teach as one with divine authority, power. That's a retroactive effect. The forward-looking effect is that the kingdom of God is even now breaking in, but at some point in the future, it will break in its fullness. And it is because of their belief in the resurrection that the early Christians came to say that Jesus is Lord, not just of the church, but of the world. Jesus is Lord, not Caesar. So the one tradition has to do with the post-resurrection appearances. Now we know that women were the first witnesses to the resurrection, right? Some of you may have seen that cartoon already. I think it was done by the Naked Pastor. I don't know if you know the cartoonist called the Naked Pastor. Anyways, the women who went to the tomb and saw the empty tomb and saw the risen Christ, they came back to tell the disciples about this. And the disciples' response was, well, thanks, we'll take it from here. So my point here, if you read on, is that if the whole resurrection narrative or narratives were fabricated, they wouldn't have included the women as witnesses, because women in Jesus' time were not considered to be reliable witnesses. So if they were making up this story from whole fabric, why would they include women who were not considered to be reliable? Just point out that in Paul's account of the resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15, he doesn't include women, but the NRSV includes sisters among the 500. So make it inclusive. So the other tradition then, so we have the resurrection appearances. That's one tradition. The other tradition is the empty tomb accounts in each of the Gospels have those. So many New Testament scholars think these two traditions actually developed separately, but they eventually came together to corroborate each other. Now, as I'm sure you all are aware, we have these multiple accounts of resurrection and appearances in the empty tomb and so forth in the gospel. We have 4 gospels and we have 4 different accounts. And they don't necessarily agree or align with each other's. So how many women were at the gravesite, for example? Or how many angels were there? Was there an appearance of Jesus at the tomb or not? So again, I would say if this whole resurrection and empty tomb narrative were fabricated, they would have made sure that they agree with each other, but they didn't agree with each other, which to me lends some authenticity to the story. So, outcomes of the resurrection. So I already mentioned that disciples were utterly bereft after Jesus' death. They took up their former lives. They were at first even perplexed by the resurrection appearances. So given this despondency on the part of the disciples initially, how do we account for the apostles preaching the gospel and the amazing spread of the gospel of the Christian church. There's really no other way to account for that than to affirm that, in fact, they believed, at least, it's a question for us, but they believed that God had raised Jesus from the dead. When they became convinced of that, they had this radical turnaround and began to believe that Jesus' death and resurrection was of a piece with Jesus' life and was a part of the gospel. And they spread that throughout the known world then. So we would not have the New Testament. What we call the New Testament were it not for the apostles' belief in Jesus' resurrection. There would be no Christian church were it not for their belief in the resurrection. And we would not be sitting here or standing here this morning in Sojourner Sunday School class if it weren't for the fact that the early church and the early believers thought that the resurrection was in fact true. Now, the interesting thing is the New Testament itself allows for some doubt. I mean, this just seems to me to be kind of unheard of. You might want to just jump down there to my bold type at the bottom. No fledgling religion would allow doubts to be raised in its founding documents if it weren't for the fact that the early church was solidly behind the proclamation that Jesus did indeed raise from the dead. So in Matthew, for example, Matthew said they worshiped him, but some doubted. Has that ever jumped out at you? In Mark, we have a number of endings, but the shortest one, just read the shortest one time. It kind of it ends in mystery. And then in Luke, when the women discovered the empty tomb and the risen Christ, they went to tell the disciples about what they had witnessed. And Luke said it seemed to them like an idle tale. And they did not believe the women. And later, Luke says of the disciples, while in their joy, they were disbelieving and still wondering. Isn't that an amazing statement? And then, of course, in John, we have I think you can say, infamous story about the doubting Thomas. Again, I say the fact that the New Testament acknowledges the existence of some doubts on the part of the disciples, to me, again, suggests authenticity about their ultimate experience. So, on Jesus' resurrection and ours. So, the pivotal text for the resurrection in the New Testament is, of course, 1 Corinthians 15. For Paul, the resurrection of the body meant the imperishable life of a new body, not the return to life of an old body. So, Lazarus, he was raised from the dead. Well, he had the same body he had before. So what we experience in resurrection is not what Lazarus experienced. We are raised to new life with a new imperishable body. So it's not resuscitation. It's very different from that. What about a spiritual resurrection? There are many people who would adopt the idea that, well, it's just a spiritual resurrection. It's not a bodily resurrection. Well, you can see what my response is on that. Again, goes back to what I talked about last time. In the New Testament, we have this holistic understanding of the human self. We are mind, body, and spirit, a unified self. Soma is the Greek word for body. And because of this understanding of the body in the New Testament, Paul comes to the conclusion that, in fact, yes, the resurrection will be a bodily one. Now, what kind of body? We don't know. If Jesus is the clue to that, there was some continuity between Jesus' old body and his new body, but there was also discontinuity. But he was not like a ghost or an angel. Okay. So, talking about what's oftentimes referred to in Christian theology as the last things, or eschatological realities, whatever. Heaven, paradise, the interim state, and so forth. I find this quote from C.S. Lewis intriguing. Just remember, C.S. Lewis was a very orthodox Christian. But listen to this. Don't come talking to me about the consolations of religion, or I shall suspect that you don't understand. He's writing out of the grief of the loss of his wife. Unless, of course, you literally believe all that stuff about family reunions on the further shore, pictured in entirely earthly terms. But that is unscriptural, all out of bad hymns and lithographs. There is not a word of it in the Bible. So I don't know how many of you were here when the funeral was held for and now I'm blanking on his name. Dan Schrock's dad. Dan Schrock's, yeah, his dad taught at Bethany. He was a member of this congregation. What was his?
Javon.
Devon. So yeah, Devon was a member of this congregation. So his funeral was here, but his son Dan, pastor many years at Berkey Avenue, he did what I don't think I could have done. He actually had the sermon at his dad's funeral, and I went to him afterwards and I said that was the best funeral sermon I've ever heard, and it was a very biblical sermon, and it dismissed this whole idea that as soon as we die, we go to this glorious place called heaven, and we have this family reunion with all of our loved ones. And that comes from both medieval understandings about the next life as well as Victorian era, which domesticated heaven and made it out to be kind of a family reunion, which actually is kind of a denial of the resurrection, really. So this quote from N.T. Wright, who is a well-known New Testament scholar, Anglican from England, and who himself was actually pretty orthodox theologically. He said, when Jesus tells a brigand that he will join him in paradise that very day, paradise clearly cannot be their ultimate destiny, as Luke's gospel makes clear. Paradise is rather the blissful garden where God's people rest prior to the resurrection. When Jesus declares that there were many dwelling places in his Father's house, the word for dwelling places is mone, which denotes a temporary lodging. Temporary lodging. So when Paul says that his desire is to depart and be with Christ, which is far better, he is indeed thinking of a blissful life with his Lord immediately after death. But this is only the prelude to the resurrection itself. So there is this intermediate state that we can hope for. And then last things, new heaven and new earth. So resurrection in the New Testament is not an individualistic thing. It involves the whole people of God, so it's communal, but it's also global and it's cosmic. It talks about new heavens and new earth. I'm not going to read this, but interesting thing is that when this cosmic transformation happens, God comes down from the heavens and lives with us on earth. God makes his abode with us here on this earth. My dad was a very conservative person, theologically and politically. But I remember when he pointed out to me that we don't go up to heaven, but God eventually comes down and makes God's abode with us. So, kingdom of God is already present, but not in its fullness. That is still to come. We pray, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Expectation that there is still more to happen. I won't take time to read this. Again, familiar passage. Feel the need to move on. So, what about judgment? What about hell? Those are actually two different issues. I do believe that we will all experience judgment. And judgment is really ultimately about justice. It's about making things right. It's about ending history with God's bringing judgment and justice into being. So yes, there will be judgment. I am reminded of my boss at the Christian Century. His oldest son took his life at the beginning of his senior year of college, which was incredibly devastating, of course. But he didn't like to talk about it, and I didn't feel free to bring it up. But one time I was having lunch with him, and we were talking about purgatory, of all things. And he said, I think we Protestants need some kind of concept like purgatory, because my son should have to come to realization of the pain that he caused for other people in his life because of what he did. Totally took me off guard. I kind of babbled some nonsense after that. So yeah, teaching on judgment, I think, is clear, but teaching on hell is less clear. So hell in Greek is Gehenna, and Gehenna is literally the valley outside Jerusalem, where the city dump was, in which there were perpetual flames. So this is what the image was of hell in the New Testament. But understand that fire in the Bible can be purgative, purifying, rather than tormenting and punishing. So, views on hell and eternal salvation. Well, the traditional view, of course, is that some will go to heaven and live eternal bliss, and some will go to hell and live in eternal torment. There is an alternative view to that, which is identified with John Stott. I don't know how many of you know John Stott, but he was a very well-known, very, again, Orthodox Anglican theologian, and his own parents weren't Christian, and this, of course, caused him a great deal of grief. And he came to accept this understanding of annihilation, that people who don't know Jesus will not experience rebirth, but they will be just totally annihilated and will not have conscious existence. And then third option would be some form of universalism, where all will be saved. God is a God of love. We are told to love our enemies. Shouldn't we expect the same of God? So the question I ask of you who are parents, think about the worst possible thing that one of your children could do. As a parent, could you send your child to hell for all eternity for that? And if you can't do it, why would God do that? I guess I'm showing my cards. Um, you know, Karl Barth was accused of being a universalist because his doctrine of atonement kind of lent itself to that as an actual conclusion. And whenever he was accused of being that, he said, "Well, I don't want to adhere to any ism, including universalism." First Peter, but they will have to give an accounting to him who stands ready to judge the living and the dead. For this is the reason the gospel was proclaimed even to the dead, so that though they had been judged in the flesh, as everyone is judged, they might live in the spirit as God does. So I think there's a suggestion here that people may actually have another chance in the next life, or multiple chances. I don't know. But again, how can you square what Hitler did to the Jews and multiple other persons during his reign of terror, unless there isn't some kind of judgment, some kind of justice brought about in the next world? Okay, it's just a little humor here. Apparently, there's a third option between burial and cremation. That's a chipper behind behind a hearse. So I'm gonna avoid that topic. Let's move on. I have some thoughts about that, and we can come back to that if there's time. So I have some clear convictions about Christian funerals or memorial services. Um, it probably was 40 years ago that I heard Lawrence Burkholder say that funerals at College Mennonite Church are becoming increasingly about the deceased rather than God.
What?
They've increasingly become about the deceased rather than God. And I would say, well, since that time, it's probably got worse. Not always. It depends on the family, of course. Uh, I think these are the things that I would look for in a Christian funeral or memorial service. You should recognize the reality of death. We went to one of Suzanne's cousin's funeral, which was held in a funeral home. And her son was a pastor, and he kind of gave a homily. And they had open casket. Casket was, right behind the pulpit area. And he made some kind of statement. She's not dead. She's not dead. And I had to resist the temptation and to keep from getting up and saying, she is dead. She's right behind her. Right there as proof. I think a funeral or memorial service also needs to remember the deceased and give some kind of account of that person's life, for good or for bad. I think oftentimes we only talk about the good aspects of a person's life and think, oh man, I, that's kind of a rosy picture. And I had a good friend who died, and he died literally because he had a lifelong habit of smoking. And I was asked to, among others, to make a tribute. And I went to his spouse and his only child, and I said, is it okay with you if I bring up that fact? It's not to make him look bad, but it's to talk about the grace that he experienced at the end of his life. Because I asked him one time, have you been able to forgive yourself for that habit that actually led to your demise? And he was able to experience the grace of God. And they said it was okay. And I had some people say, oh, thank you. Funerals should leave time for lament, but praise and thanksgiving too. Should give comfort to the bereaved, to not entail a stoical reaction to death, and should provide assurance that nothing separates us from the love of Christ Jesus. It should be a testament to the resurrection of Jesus and our own future resurrection. We grieve, but not as people without hope. I live streamed a funeral yesterday that went on for nearly 2.5 hours, if you count the prelude. It was a funeral for John Buchanan, who was the lead pastor for years at Fourth Presbyterian Church on Michigan. And yeah, these people used to go there. Hertzers. Carolyn, you worked at Fourth Pres, didn't you? No. Well, John, you went to Fourth Pres, didn't you, when you lived in Chicago? No? Okay. You went there. Okay. So John was the publisher of the Christian Century when I was working for that. That was kind of a moonlighting job that he had. And originally I was going to go up for the service, and I had a couple things come up yesterday. I couldn't, so I live streamed it. And the Presbyterian funeral liturgy is called a witness to a service of witness to the resurrection. That's what their resurrection, their Easter, their funeral liturgy is called. And it reminds me of a story that John Buchanan told me one time. So the old guy, he used to own the Chicago Blackhawks, the hockey team, not the one who died just recently. That was his son, but the old guy who was known as a curmudgeonly guy, and fans hated him. He was actually a member of Fourth Presbyterian Church. So when he died, the family came to John's office and to plan the service, and they said, "No, we don't want anything religious." And John said, "That's what we do here." And they went ahead with the Presbyterian Christian liturgy. You can draw your own conclusions. Alan Verhey, that I mentioned last time, it is ironic that the community that has a story of death at the center of its scripture and at the center of its practices of baptism and Eucharist should fall so often silent about death and about the practice of dying well and faithfully, and of caring well and faithfully for the dying. So, look at the big picture here. The Enlightenment has taught us to, what, doubt everything, question everything, including all forms of tradition and authority, including the church, including the Bible. But if we say that resurrections can't happen, then the question of the historicity of the resurrection is already decided. But the scientists can't say what can happen. It must be left to the historian to say whether, in fact, it did happen. Jesus' resurrection was the breaking in of a new Ian into the old Ian. The new Ian can't be judged by the measures of the old Ian. And I think that we modern Christians who have been taught to think critically, and believe me, I'm a firm advocate of critical thinking. I mean, we wouldn't have modern medication like we have, it would be for critical thinking, right? But I think we have to have a poetic sensibility about these things, maybe an artistic sensibility about these things. So poetry might say it best. So Kurt Marty, it might readily suit many lords of this world if everything were settled at death, if the dominion of the lords and the servitude of the slaves were confirmed forever. It might readily suit many lords of this world if in eternity they remain lords in expensive private tombs and their slaves remain slaves in rows of common graves. But a resurrection is coming, quite different from what we had thought. A resurrection is coming, which is God's rising up against the lords and against the Lord of lords, death. Pretty powerful words. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'm sure many of you know the John Updike poem, 7 stanzas as Easter. Make no mistake, if he rose at all, it was as his body. You would agree with me. Okay, so just leave you with 2 books as possible resources. The first is N.T. Wright's book, Surprised by Hope, Rethinking Heaven, the Resurrection, and the Mission of the Church. And I already mentioned Gerhard Lofink, his book, Is This All There Is? On the Resurrection and Eternal Life. So that's it, folks.
Thank you, Richard. We don't have a lot of time for response. I have 10 till 12, but I would allow on 5, 6 minutes for anyone who wants to ask a clarification question or have a comment in response.
Thank you, Richard. I wonder if you have any more to say about paradise. As the quote from N.T. Wright showed, that paradise is not the same thing as heaven in our thinking. Nevertheless, it was there, present in Jewish thought, is paradise at all a viable concept for us as a kind of anteroom or waiting room for the resurrection?
Yeah. Phil, right? Yeah. I think if we're going to hold on to the resurrection as the New Testament calls us to, then I think we have to somehow or other deal with that intermediate state. Um, and I mean, that's been, I guess, a traditional response to, okay, so what happens between our death and our eventual resurrection? Now, the interesting thing is that that Gerhard Lofink that I referred to before, he has an interesting chapter on time and eternity. And eternity, according to him, is not the elongation of time, it's the end of time. And so that when we die, we immediately enter into whatever it is that we can expect in eternity. So it kind of almost does away with the idea of an intermediate state. So he talks about it being judged and being received by God and being resurrected is kind of almost a simultaneous event. Um, it's an intriguing thought. But to tell you the truth, I either don't have a simple enough mind or I'm not smart enough to comprehend the end of time and um, entering into eternity. So yeah, it's not a satisfactory answer, Phil. Maybe you have some thoughts on it.
Both of my parents died unexpectedly. So I never had a final conversation with either of them. Some say, well, that's not a problem. When you die, you can have a conversation with your parents then. Is that likely or unlikely?
Well, I kind of poo-pooed the idea of a resurrection being a family reunion. But I guess I'd want to maybe qualify that by saying I guess it's a question of sequencing of things. But I do hope and I think that ultimately we will have an opportunity to be reunited with our loved ones. But it's going to be a grander and bigger thing than that, and it's going to we're going to be reunited with people that we probably didn't like in this life, and we're going to be reunited with people we didn't know in this life. So there's going to be more to it than just a family reunion, I think. And again, I realize that this is kind of risky business, speculating about these things. So I'm mostly interested in talking about what the Christian hope is.